The next area of research inquiry pointing to survival, of course, is after-death communication. Now, this is really the most common area. It's one that's probably been experienced by as many as 70% of the population. But what particularly intrigued me are examples of after-death communication in which a life-changing event occurs. Now, I myself had such a life-changing event. That's why I'm speaking to you here today, because in 1972, my great uncle Harry appeared to me in a dream at the moment of his death. I was then a student of criminology, but I was so moved by the soul-to-soul communication that I ended up switching and create my doctoral major and creating a unique individual interdisciplinary parapsychology major at the University of California. But I'm not the only person whose life was changed by an after-death communication. I'd like to share with you the story of Elizabeth Kübler-Ross. She was listed by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people of the 20th century for her work on death and dying. But there was a time in her career where she felt the work was going nowhere. The seminars weren't gelling with people, and she was getting ready to resign. In fact, as she reports in this book, she was standing by the elevator about to speak to the minister at the University of Chicago with whom she was working, telling him that she's quitting. She's getting out of the death work that she was doing, the stages of preparation for death and so on. At that moment, a woman walked up to her and said, "Do you mind if I walk with you to your office?" So they went to the office. Elizabeth Kübler-Ross never quit. And as she's walking along the hallway with this woman, she recognizes Mrs. Schwartz. Mrs. Schwartz is the woman who first told Elizabeth Kübler-Ross about her near-death experience. It was Kübler-Ross's first introduction to the very thought of a near-death experience. This was back in the mid-1970s, roughly, I think maybe even a little before Raymond Moody's book came out. The thing is that Mrs. Schwartz had died about 10 months earlier. When they got to Elizabeth Kübler-Ross's office, Mrs. Schwartz turned to her, looked her right in the eye, and said, "You must promise me never to give up this work that you're doing." Elizabeth Kübler-Ross describes it as a soul-to-soul connection, very much akin to the experience I had with Uncle Harry when he visited me in a life-changing dream. She felt that the two of them understood each other deeply, telepathically, but she had the presence of mind to ask Mrs. Schwartz, would she mind writing a note to her? And Mrs. Schwartz did. She wrote that note, and Elizabeth Kübler-Ross kept it, used to hold it up in the lectures that she gave. And then Mrs. Schwartz walked out of the office. Immediately, Elizabeth Kübler-Ross turned to the door to look and see her walking down the hallway, but there was no one there. Another example of an after-death communication actually led to a whole school of psychotherapy being founded. And this book is about that form of therapy, written by Bob Hoffman. It says The Discoveries of the Fisher-Hoffman Process. Well, Bob Hoffman was a tailor in Oakland, California, and he had been a therapy client of Dr. Siegfried Fisher, who had died a year prior to the experience when Hoffman woke up in the middle of the night to discover Dr. Fisher standing at the foot of his bed, explaining to him that since his death, he had discovered the problems with psychotherapy and had come up with a whole new form of therapy that he took Bob Hoffman through. And then he instructed Bob Hoffman to go out and teach this form of therapy to the world at large. And Hoffman said to him, me, I'm a tailor. How am I supposed to convince anybody about a new school of psychotherapy? And Hoffman said to him, don't worry, doors will open. And indeed, doors did open for him. Today, decades later, it's now called the Hoffman quadrinity process, and it is still being offered around the world today. I think it's about 50 years already have passed. So it's a very important example of a life-changing experience. I have interviewed, for example, Dr. Charles Tart, the renowned author of Altered States of Consciousness and many other books about consciousness, who was once asked on my television video series, what was the most profound experience of his life? And he went on to talk about going through the Fisher-Hoffman process. So even though neither I nor Charlie Tart could validate the fact that Hoffman's experience of encountering Fisher really occurred, from a pragmatic point of view, when you put together a whole school of psychotherapy, you have to say it worked. It might very well, in fact, probably is real, as accounted for, especially in light of the many other areas pointing to survival of bodily death. Now, another example of after-death communication is from Whitley Strieber, the renowned author of Communion. Whitley, of course, is mostly known for a UFO abduction experience that he had, but he became deeply interested in the question of survival after death and its relationship to UFO encounters. And here he describes a very profound after-death communications with his deceased wife, Anne.
After she passed away, for example, she began to come back first to friends. And I was sitting in the living room at 9:30 that night, and she died at 7:15. And I cannot tell you how bereft I was, because she was an immense presence. She was brilliant beyond anyone I have ever known, with a huge mind and a very extraordinarily global capability in her thought processes. She could think big thoughts. And so I was sitting there feeling as if the biggest part of my mind had disappeared. And I was thinking, Annie, if you exist at all in any way, you must let me know somehow. The phone rang. And I thought, my God, I cannot imagine answering the phone. And yet it was a friend of Anne's. And no one knew, just a few people knew at that point that Anne had died. And this woman didn't know. She couldn't have, I don't think. So the next thing I knew, I answered the phone and she said, Whitley, it's Belle. And something odd just happened. I just heard Anne say in my ear to call Whitley. Is she all right? She knew Anne was sick, of course. I said, no, she's not all right, Belle. She died a little while ago. And that was the first of many such calls. And then I remembered that we had talked about back in the 90s, when Anne had realized that the whole close encounter experience and the reappearance of the dead friends and relatives in people's lives were connected. She'd said, well, if there is such a thing as an afterlife, let's make a pact. We'll come back if we can and contact other people, not each other, because if you try to contact me, Whitley, I'll never believe it. And I know you won't either. And that was quite true. But once this had started to happen, after a week or so, I realized that she was still here.